She cared for a disabled stranger, not knowing he was a millionaire who would fall for her. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like a gentle embrace as Nia Holloway stepped out of her weathered Honda Civic, clutching a thermos of hibiscus tea and a worn copy of Maya Angelou's poetry. Asheville's autumn air carried the scent of pine and possibility, though Nia felt neither peaceful nor optimistic as she stared up at the imposing glass mansion perched on the hillside. Her fingers unconsciously touched the small silver locket around her neck, the only thing left of her sister Maya, who had died 3 years ago in a car accident, leaving behind 8-year-old Zara, the same accident that had shattered Nia's world and rebuilt it around one simple truth: everyone deserved to be cared for, especially when they couldn't care for themselves. "Another day, another broken soul," she whispered, adjusting her nursing bag and steeling herself for what lay ahead. The agency had warned her about Julian Whittaker. "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it," her supervisor had said, shaking her head. 3 caregivers in 2 months. The man's a fortress, and he's not interested in letting anyone in. Word is he's got millions tied up in some corporate mess, and the stress is eating him alive. Nia understood fortresses. She'd built plenty of her own after Maya's death, when grief had threatened to swallow her whole. But walls meant to keep pain out usually ended up keeping life out too. The front door opened before she could knock, revealing a petite woman with kind eyes and graying temples pulled back in a neat bun. Despite her professional appearance, exhaustion lined her features. "You must be Nia. I'm Carmen Rodriguez, Mr. Whittaker's assistant. Thank goodness you're here." Carmen's relief was palpable as she ushered Nia inside. "I was starting to think we'd never find someone willing to stay." "That bad?" Nia asked, following Carmen through hallways lined with expensive art that somehow felt cold despite their obvious beauty. Everything was pristine, modern, and utterly devoid of warmth. "He fired the last caregiver for humming," Carmen said with a weary smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And before that, one was dismissed for excessive optimism, and another for asking too many questions about his physical therapy routine." They paused outside a set of mahogany doors. Through the frosted glass panels, Nia could see a figure in a wheelchair, silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the valley. Even from behind, she could sense the tension radiating from him, the way he held himself like a man preparing for battle, or perhaps already fighting one. "Mr. Whittaker," Carmen called softly, knocking twice. "Your new caregiver is here. Send her away." The voice was deep, cultured, and sharp enough to cut glass. "I told you yesterday, Carmen. I don't need a babysitter." Carmen's shoulders sagged slightly, but Nia stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "Good morning, Mr. Whittaker. I'm Nia Holloway, and I'm not going anywhere just yet." The wheelchair turned, and she got her first full look at Julian Whittaker. The tabloids hadn't done him justice, even in their endless coverage of his accident 18 months ago. His dark hair was disheveled, his jaw shadowed with stubble that suggested he'd given up on appearances. But his eyes, steel grey and piercing, held a pain so deep it made her chest tighten with recognition. This wasn't just a man who'd lost the use of his legs in a climbing accident. This was a man who'd lost himself entirely. "I don't care who you are," he said, his gaze sweeping over her with calculated dismissal. "I didn't ask for you. I don't want you here, and I guarantee you won't last the week. Ask Carmen about the others." Instead of retreating, Nia set her thermos on the sleek coffee table and settled into the leather chair across from him, uninvited. She pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open with deliberate calm. "Probably not," she agreed, her tone conversational. "But I'm contracted for 5 days minimum. So unless you're planning to physically remove me, which, no offense, might prove challenging in your current situation, we're stuck with each other until Friday." Julian's mouth fell open slightly, clearly stunned by her directness. Then his eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you mocking me? Would I do that?" Nia asked, meeting his glare with steady composure. She unscrewed her thermos, releasing the floral scent of hibiscus into the sterile air. I brought tea, if you're interested. Hibiscus, good for circulation, blood pressure, and mood stabilization. I don't drink tea. What do you drink? Whiskey. Starting at noon if I'm feeling optimistic. Nia glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum marking time with relentless precision. It's 9 in the morning. Your point? She stood, walking to the expansive windows where morning light painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in autumn foliage, the distant peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains standing sentinel over Asheville's peaceful landscape. My sister used to say that pain makes us do stupid things, she said, her voice soft but clear. The trick is figuring out which stupid things actually help and which ones just make everything worse. Profound, Julian replied, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Did she embroider that wisdom on a decorative pillow? She died before she got the chance, Nia replied, without turning around, her fingers tracing the condensation on the window. Car accident 3 years ago. Left behind an 8-year-old daughter who still asks me every night when her mama's coming home. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding, heavy with the weight of shared loss. When Nia finally turned back, Julian was studying her with something that might have been curiosity, his defensive mask slipping just slightly. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and she heard genuine sincerity beneath the roughness of his voice. So am I, she replied, moving to examine his bookshelf. But sorry doesn't change anything. What we do next, that's what matters. Her fingers traced along leather-bound spines, philosophy texts, business journals, legal documents, until she found something unexpected. A slim volume of poetry tucked between thick corporate tomes, its pages worn from use. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill, she quoted softly, of things unknown but longed for still. Julian's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. Don't, he whispered. Maya Angelou understood cages. Nia continued gently, pulling the book free and cradling it like the treasure it clearly was. She knew about being trapped, about losing pieces of yourself you thought were permanent. But she also knew about finding your voice again, about singing even when the bars seem impossible to break. This isn't poetry therapy hour, Julian said, but his voice had lost its cutting edge, replaced by something rawer and more vulnerable. No, Nia agreed, settling back into her chair and pouring 2 cups of tea, the hibiscus steam curling between them like incense. This is just Tuesday morning in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm just a woman who makes really good tea and happens to believe that everyone deserves to be heard, even when they're convinced they have nothing left to say. She set 1 cup within his reach, close enough that he could take it if he chose, far enough away that he wouldn't feel pressured. I'm not here to fix you, Mr. Whitaker, she said, her brown eyes meeting his grey ones with unflinching honesty. I'm here to make sure you eat your meals, take your medications, and don't die on my watch. Everything else, the talking, the trusting, the deciding whether tomorrow's worth seeing, that's entirely up to you. Julian stared at the steaming cup, then at her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't expected to encounter. You're different from the others, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How so? His answer came slowly, reluctantly, like a confession he'd never intended to make. They wanted to help me heal. You just want to keep me alive. Nia smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd worn since walking through his door. Sometimes, Mr. Whitaker, that's exactly the same thing. The hibiscus tea grew cold between them as Julian stared at the cup, his hands resting motionless on the arms of his wheelchair. Nia had learned to read silence in her 3 years as a caregiver. Some silences were hostile, others fearful, and a few, like this one, were simply exhausted. Carmen mentioned you have physical therapy scheduled for 10, she said, checking her notes. Dr. Rodriguez wants you working on upper body strength and transfer techniques. Dr. Rodriguez can want whatever he likes, Julian replied, finally lifting his eyes from the tea. I'm not interested in learning to live like this. Like what? Broken. The word fell between them like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples neither of them could ignore. Useless. A burden on everyone unfortunate enough to know me. Nia set down her own cup with deliberate care. Is that what you think? That you're useless? I think, Julian said, his voice gaining strength, that 18 months ago I could climb mountains, run marathons, and build companies from nothing. Now I can't even get to the bathroom without help. The vulnerability in his admission caught them both off guard. Julian's jaw tightened, as if he regretted the words the moment they left his mouth. Tell me about the mountains, Nia said softly. What? You mentioned climbing. What was your favorite peak? Julian's laugh was bitter, hollow. Are we really doing this, the let's talk about happier times therapy session? We're doing whatever gets you through the next hour without reaching for that whiskey bottle I noticed behind the law books. Nia's tone was matter-of-fact, not judgmental. So mountains, tell me. For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Then, almost against his will, his gaze drifted to a framed photograph on his desk, barely visible from where Nia sat, but clearly precious to him. Mount Washington, he said finally, in New Hampshire. I climbed it every year on the anniversary of my father's death. How did he die? Heart attack. At his desk, reviewing quarterly reports at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Julian's fingers drummed against his wheelchair. He was 48, never took a vacation longer than 3 days, never missed a board meeting, never saw the point in anything that didn't increase the company's value. Nia heard the unspoken words, just like me, and Mount Washington was different. It was the only place where none of that mattered. Up there, you're just another human being, trying not to fall off a cliff. Julian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For the first time I climbed it, I was 22 and angry at the world, thought I could conquer anything, including grief. What happened? I got lost in a storm, spent 8 hours huddled behind a rock, convinced I was going to die like some amateur tourist. Julian's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. A rescue team found me at dawn, hypothermic and humbled. The lead climber was this 60-year-old woman named Ruth, who told me mountains don't care about your bank account or your ego. They only respect your preparation and your humility. Sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. Ruth taught me that every mountain has its own personality, its own challenges, that the goal isn't to conquer them, but to learn from them. Julian's voice grew quieter. I climbed with her team for years. Every summit taught me something new about myself. What did Mount Washington teach you? Julian was quiet for so long that Nia wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible. That some falls you don't recover from. The weight of his statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. Through the windows, Nia could see Carmen in the garden, deadheading roses with the methodical care of someone trying to maintain beauty in a world that seemed determined to let everything wither. I fell too, you know, Nia said eventually, after Maya died. Lost my job, my apartment, nearly lost Zara to social services because I couldn't get out of bed for 3 weeks. Julian's eyes sharpened with interest despite himself. And what changed? Zara drew me a picture. Nia smiled at the memory. It was supposed to be the two of us, but she'd drawn 3 stick figures instead. When I asked who the third person was, she said, "That's Mama. She lives in our hearts now, so she goes everywhere with us." 8-year-olds see things differently. Sometimes they see things more clearly. Nia stood, moving to examine a chess set positioned by the window, clearly expensive, probably never used. She was right, though. Maya does go everywhere with me. Her voice is in every cup of tea I make, every Maya Angelou poem I read, every time I refuse to give up on someone who's given up on themselves. Is that what you think you're doing here? Not giving up on me? Nia picked up the white king, feeling its weight in her palm. I think you're a man who's forgotten that falling doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. Easy words from someone who can still walk. The sharpness was back in his voice, but Nia heard the pain beneath it, raw and fresh as an open wound. "You're right," she said simply. "I can walk, I can run, climb stairs, dance at Zara's school recitals, and someday that might change too. We're all just one moment away from everything being different." She set the chess piece back in its place with gentle precision. But right now, in this moment, you're alive. Your mind is sharp, your hands are strong, and you have resources most people can only dream of. The question isn't whether you can still climb mountains, Julian. The question is, what mountain are you going to climb next? Julian stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Not acceptance, exactly, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of curiosity. "And the physical therapy starts in 20 minutes, he said finally. "I'll be there. To make sure I don't give Dr. Rodriguez a hard time? To make sure you don't give yourself one?" Nia gathered her things, pausing at the door. And Julian, Ruth was right about mountains respecting preparation and humility, but she left out the most important part, which is, they also respect courage. The kind that gets you up the next morning, even when everything hurts. As she left him there, staring out at the mountains that had once called to him, Nia couldn't help but wonder if somewhere beneath all that pain and anger, Julian Whittaker's courage was just waiting for the right moment to climb again. Dr. Rodriguez's therapy room smelled like rubber mats and determination. Julian gripped the parallel bars with white knuckles, sweat beading on his forehead as he attempted to support his weight with his arms. His shoulders trembled with the effort, muscles that had once carried him up cliffsides now struggling with the simple act of lifting his body. "Breathe through it," Dr. Rodriguez encouraged, his voice calm and professional. "Remember, we're building endurance, not breaking records." "Tell that to my arms," Julian muttered through gritted teeth, lowering himself back into his wheelchair with barely controlled collapse. Nia sat quietly in the corner, ostensibly reading her Maya Angelou collection, but actually observing every nuance of Julian's struggle. She'd seen this pattern before, the way pride warred with necessity, how each small victory felt simultaneously triumphant and insufficient. "That's enough for today," Dr. Rodriguez said, making notes on his clipboard. "Your upper body strength has improved 30% since last month. At this rate, I'll be ready for the Special Olympics by Christmas." Julian interrupted, his voice dripping with self-deprecation. "Julian," Dr. Rodriguez's tone carried gentle reproach. "Progress is progress. Recovery isn't a race." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who—" Julian stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching shut, as if he'd caught himself before revealing something he shouldn't. Nia looked up from her book, noticing the way Carmen had suddenly gone very still by the equipment rack, how her eyes darted nervously between Julian and the door. There was something here, some undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with physical therapy. After Dr. Rodriguez left, promising to return Thursday, Carmen approached Julian with hesitant steps. "The lawyers called again," she said quietly. "They need an answer about the deposition. Mr. Chen says—" "I don't care what Chen says." Julian's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell them I'm unavailable. Julian, you can't keep avoiding this. The SEC investigation won't disappear just because you're—" "Because I'm what, Carmen? Crippled, broken, unable to defend myself." His words crackled with barely contained fury. Carmen glanced at Nia apologetically. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No." Julian's grey eyes blazed with something dangerous. "Ms. Holloway is going to hear about it eventually anyway. Might as well get it over with." Nia closed her book slowly, sensing she was about to step into quicksand. "If this is confidential—" "Nothing's confidential anymore," Julian said bitterly. "But not since Victoria decided to throw me to the wolves." Carmen winced. "Julian, please, you don't know that she—" "Don't I?" Julian spun his wheelchair to face them both, his expression thunderous. "My ex-fiancée, who had access to all my personal files, who knew about every business deal, every contract, every decision I made. 3 weeks after she called off our engagement, the SEC comes knocking with inside information about Whittaker Industries' overseas investments. You tell me that's a coincidence. The pieces were starting to fall into place for Nia, the isolation, the bitterness that went deeper than physical trauma, the way Julian looked at his phone like it might explode. This wasn't just about a climbing accident. This was about betrayal, about having your most intimate trust weaponized against you. What kind of investigation? She asked quietly. Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. The kind that destroys everything you've spent your life building. Allegations of insider trading, tax evasion, bribery of foreign officials. None of it true, but truth doesn't matter when the media gets hold of it. The climbing accident, Nia said slowly, understanding dawning. And when did it happen? 2 days after Victoria left me. 2 days after I found out she'd been feeding information to my business rivals for months. Julian's hands clenched into fists. I went climbing to clear my head, to figure out how to salvage my company, my reputation, my life. Instead, I fell 40 feet and shattered 3 vertebrae. Oh, Julian. Carmen's voice was thick with sympathy she'd clearly been holding back for months. The worst part, Julian continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, part of me wonders if it wasn't an accident, if somewhere in my subconscious I just let go. The admission hung in the air like a confession too dangerous to acknowledge. Nia felt her heart break a little for this man who carried so much pain, so much guilt, so much fear, that he'd rather believe himself suicidal than simply human and fallible. Where is she now? Nia asked. Now, Victoria, engaged to Harrison Mitchell, CEO of Mitchell & Associates, my biggest competitor. Julian's smile was razor thin. They announced it in Forbes last month. A merger of hearts and minds, the article called it. And you think she's still feeding them information? I think Victoria Sterling is the smartest, most ruthless woman I've ever known. I think she played a long game, and I was too blind with love to see it coming. Julian stared out the window at the mountains that had once been his refuge. The climbing accident brought me some sympathy in the press, but that's wearing thin. The SEC wants to depose me next month. If I can't provide convincing answers about those offshore accounts I never opened, investments I never authorized, I'll lose everything. Everything except your life, Nia pointed out gently. Is it still my life if I'm bankrupt, discredited and confined to this chair? Yes. The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. Julian, you are not your company. You're not your bank account, or your reputation, or even your legs. You're a human being with value that exists completely independent of any of those things. You don't understand. I understand that you're so afraid of being vulnerable that you'd rather believe you're worthless than accept help. Nia stood, moving closer to his wheelchair. I understand that Victoria hurt you, and the investigation scares you, and losing your mobility feels like losing yourself. But I also understand that sitting in this house, drinking whiskey and feeling sorry for yourself, isn't going to solve any of it. Julian stared at her, with an expression caught between anger and something that might have been hope. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to stop running from the fight and start figuring out how to win it. Nia picked up her book, tucking it under her arm. And even if you have to do it from a wheelchair. Carmen cleared her throat softly. The lawyers are coming tomorrow at 2. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to listen to what they have to say. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his eyes. Not acceptance exactly, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of determination. All right, he said quietly. But I want Nia there. Julian, I'm not a lawyer. No, he said, meeting her eyes with startling intensity. But you're the first person in 18 months who's looked at me and seen something worth fighting for. If I'm going to do this, I need someone in my corner who still believes I'm worth saving. As Nia nodded her agreement, she couldn't help but wonder what she was getting herself into. But looking at Julian, really looking at him, beyond the wheelchair and the pain and the walls he'd built around himself, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Some mountains, she was beginning to understand, could only be climbed together. The lawyers arrived like storm clouds, dark suits, briefcases, and expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. Nia watched from the kitchen as Carmen ushered them into Julian's study, their voices low and urgent even before the doors closed. She'd spent the morning researching Whitaker Industries on her phone, piecing together fragments of Julian's story from business journals and news articles. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd built an empire through calculated risks and innovative thinking, only to watch it crumble under allegations he swore were false. "You don't have to do this," she'd told him over breakfast, noting how his hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee. "Yes, I do," he'd replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. "I've been hiding long enough." Now, listening to the muffled voices through the heavy doors, Nia wondered if courage and stupidity were sometimes indistinguishable. Her phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor, Zara, asking when you're coming home. Should I tell her you're helping another sad person get happy again? Nia smiled, despite her anxiety. That's how Zara understood her work, helping sad people find their way back to happiness. If only it were that simple. The study doors burst open, and one of the lawyers, a sharp-faced woman with steel-grey hair, emerged looking thunderous. "Mr. Whitaker, you cannot continue to be uncooperative. The SEC isn't going away, and your refusal to address these allegations is only making things worse." "I've addressed them," Julian's voice carried from inside the room, tight with controlled anger. "I've provided every document you've requested, answered every question, submitted to every audit. What more do you want? We want you to consider the plea agreement." The words hit the air like a gunshot. Nia set down her teacup, her heart rate spiking. Plea agreement meant they wanted Julian to admit guilt to crimes he claimed he hadn't committed. Absolutely not. Julian's response was immediate and fierce. The lawyer, her name tag read Patricia Hendricks, senior partner, pinched the bridge of her nose. Julian listened to reason. 3 years probation, a substantial fine, and resignation from the board. You keep your personal assets, avoid prison time, and this nightmare ends. It ends with me admitting to federal crimes I didn't commit. It ends with you having a future. Another voice interjected, male, older, paternal in tone. "Son, sometimes the best move is to cut your losses and start over." "Start over as what? David? A convicted felon? A man who betrayed the trust of every investor who believed in me?" Julian's voice cracked slightly. "And I'd rather fight and lose than surrender and live with that lie." Nia found herself moving toward the door before she'd consciously decided to intervene. She knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. The room felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Julian sat behind his massive desk, paperwork scattered around him like battle plans. 3 lawyers occupied the chairs opposite him. Patricia Hendricks, an older man with kind eyes who must be David, and a younger associate taking frantic notes. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Nia said, her voice calm despite the tension. "But Julian, you have a physical therapy appointment in 20 minutes. It was a lie, but it gave him an escape route if he needed one. "Actually," Julian said, his grey eyes meeting hers with something like gratitude, "I'd like Nia to stay. She's been helping me organize my thoughts about the case." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Whitaker, this is highly confidential." "She signed an NDA yesterday," Julian said smoothly, another lie delivered with perfect conviction. "Nia, please, sit." As she settled into the chair beside Julian's wheelchair, Nia caught a glimpse of the documents spread across his desk. Bank statements, wire transfer records, correspondence with foreign investors, a paper trail that either proved his innocence or damned him completely. "The evidence against you is substantial," Patricia continued, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Victoria Sterling provided the SEC with detailed records of conversations, meetings, decisions." "Conversations taken out of context," Julian interrupted. "Meetings where she was present but clearly misunderstood what was being discussed. She's not a financial expert, Patricia." She's a marketing consultant who happened to be sleeping with the CEO. She's also willing to testify under oath that you knowingly engaged in illegal activities. The silence that followed was deafening. Nia watched Julian's face cycle through emotions: pain, betrayal, rage, and finally, a cold determination she hadn't seen before. "Let me ask you something," he said quietly. "Have any of you actually looked at the timeline of these alleged crimes?" David frowned. What do you mean?" "I mean the SEC claims I authorized illegal wire transfers and bribed foreign officials between March and June of last year. But if you check the medical records, you'll find that I was in the hospital or rehabilitation for most of that period." Julian's voice gained strength. "Hard to authorize million-dollar bribes when you're relearning how to use your hands." The lawyers exchanged glances. Patricia shuffled through her papers with new urgency. That's not what the timeline suggests," she said, but uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Then maybe you should look harder," Nia said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. "Because if Julian was physically incapable of committing these crimes, then someone else was using his access, his accounts, his identity." Julian turned to stare at her, something shifting in his expression, not just gratitude, but recognition. As if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "Victoria had power of attorney while I was hospitalized," he said slowly, the pieces falling into place even as he spoke. "She had access to everything: my accounts, my passwords, my signature authority." "You're suggesting she framed you?" David asked, his voice skeptical. "I'm suggesting that a woman smart enough to play a 2-year-long con might be smart enough to cover her tracks by destroying the man who trusted her most." Julian's hands clenched into fists. "The question is, are you my lawyers, or are you here to help her finish the job?" Patricia Hendricks closed her folder with a sharp snap. "We'll need to review everything again. The medical records, the timeline, the power of attorney documents." "Good," Julian said. And while you're at it, I want you to start building a case against Victoria Sterling for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy." As the lawyers gathered their things and filed out, promising to be in touch within 48 hours, Nia felt the air in the room slowly return to normal pressure. "Thank you," Julian said quietly once they were alone. For what?" "For believing I was worth fighting for, before I remembered how to fight for myself." He reached over and took her hand, the first time he'd initiated physical contact since she'd arrived, "for seeing what I couldn't see." "What's that?" Julian smiled, then really smiled, for the first time since she'd known him. "That sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and that I don't have to climb this mountain alone." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Blue Ridge Mountains, but for the first time in months, Julian Whittaker looked ready to weather whatever came next. The rain came that evening like a benediction, washing the mountains clean and filling the house with the rhythmic percussion of water against glass. Nia found Julian in his study at nearly midnight, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers, his laptop screen casting blue shadows across his determined face. "You should be sleeping," she said from the doorway, noting the empty coffee cups and crumpled papers that suggested he'd been there for hours. "Can't sleep." He didn't look up from the screen. "I keep finding more pieces of the puzzle. Look at this." He gestured to a spreadsheet covered in highlighted entries. "Every suspicious transaction happened while I was either unconscious or heavily medicated. Victoria had complete control of my finances for 3 months." Nia approached his desk, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She'd changed into comfortable clothes after her official shift ended, soft grey pants and one of Maya's old sweaters that still smelled faintly of her sister's perfume. "Julian, it's midnight. This will all be here in the morning." "Will it?" He finally looked up, and she was startled by the intensity in his grey eyes. "What if she's still out there, destroying evidence? What if by tomorrow there's nothing left to prove my innocence?" "Then we'll prove it another way." Nia moved behind his chair, gently placing her hands on his shoulders. She could feel the tension there, muscles knotted with stress and exhaustion. But you can't fight a war if you're too tired to think straight. For a moment, Julian seemed ready to argue. Then her fingers found a particularly tight spot at the base of his neck, and he exhaled shakily. "I haven't slept well since the accident," he admitted quietly. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm falling again. Sometimes it's from the cliff, sometimes it's into bankruptcy, sometimes it's just falling forever." "Is that why you stay up so late? To avoid the dreams?" "Partly." His voice was barely a whisper. "But also because the quiet gives me too much time to think about what I lost, what I'll never have again, about whether Victoria ever loved me at all, or if I was just a mark from the beginning." The vulnerability in his admission made Nia's chest tighten. Without thinking, she began working at the knots in his shoulders, her touch gentle but firm. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "And what was she like when you first met?" Julian was quiet for so long that Nia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a wistfulness that broke her heart. "Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She walked into a board meeting 2 years ago to present a marketing proposal, and within 10 minutes she'd identified problems with our strategy that my team had missed for months." He tilted his head slightly, unconsciously leaning into Nia's touch. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her mind that captivated me. The way she could see solutions where others saw only obstacles. "When did you know you loved her?" 6 months later. We were climbing together. She'd never done it before, but she wanted to learn because it mattered to me. Julian's laugh was soft and sad. She was terrified, but she trusted me completely. When we reached the summit, she said it was the first time she'd ever felt truly free. Nia's hands stilled. "She climbed with you every weekend for a year. She said she understood me better on the mountains than anywhere else." Julian's shoulders tensed again. Looking back, I wonder if she was just studying me, learning my patterns, my weaknesses, the best ways to hurt me. Or maybe, Nia said carefully, she was falling in love with someone she knew she was going to betray, and it scared her enough to run. Julian turned in his chair to face her, his expression unreadable. "You think she loved me? I think love makes people do terrible things sometimes, especially when they're trapped between their feelings and their ambitions." Nia settled into the chair across from him. "It doesn't excuse what she did, but it might explain it. Does it matter? Love without loyalty is just another form of manipulation. Maybe, or maybe it's just human." Nia pulled her knees to her chest, making herself smaller in the large leather chair. "Maya used to say that the people who hurt us most are usually the ones fighting their own battles. Doesn't make the pain less real, but it makes the person more complicated." "Your sister sounds like she was wise." "She was, also stubborn, reckless, and completely incapable of backing down from a fight." Nia smiled at the memory. "She would have liked you, I think, before the accident, when you were conquering mountains and building empires. And now?" Nia met his eyes steadily. "Now she would have told you that the best climbers aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who figure out how to get back up." The silence that followed was different from their earlier conversations, warmer, more intimate. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the house felt cocooned from the rest of the world. "Nia," Julian said quietly, "why did you really become a caregiver?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected him to probe about her sister, her past, her relationship with Zara. Not this. "After Maya died, I spent weeks in the hospital with her before the end. I watched the nurses, how they could bring comfort just by being present, by seeing each patient as a whole person instead of just their illness or injury." Nia's voice grew thoughtful. "I realized I wanted to be that for people. Someone who sees them when they can't see themselves. Is that what you see when you look at me?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. "I see a man who's forgotten that he's more than the worst thing that's happened to him," she said finally. "I see someone who's been hurt so badly he's afraid to trust his own judgment. But I also see strength, intelligence, and a capacity for love that terrifies him because it makes him vulnerable. Julian's breath caught. Nia. I should go, she said quickly, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how intimate the conversation had become. You need sleep, and I need to check on Zara in the morning. But as she stood to leave, Julian reached out and caught her hand. Thank you, he said simply, for seeing me, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. His thumb traced across her knuckles, and Nia felt something shift between them, a recognition of connection that went deeper than caregiver and patient, deeper than friendship. Julian, she whispered, but she couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice the feeling that was growing in her chest, warm and terrifying and absolutely impossible. He seemed to understand anyway. His grip on her hand tightened for a moment, then loosened, allowing her to step away. Good night, Nia. Good night. As she walked to her room, Nia could feel the weight of everything unspoken between them. She was falling for him, had been falling since that first morning when he'd shown her his vulnerability beneath all that anger. But Julian Whittaker was her patient, her responsibility, a man fighting for his reputation and his freedom, with enemies who wouldn't hesitate to use anyone close to him as a weapon. And yet, as she lay in bed, listening to the rain and thinking about the way he'd said her name, Nia couldn't bring herself to regret the dangerous territory her heart was leading her into. Some mountains, she was learning, called to you even when you knew climbing them might destroy you. The call came at 7 in the morning, shattering the peaceful quiet of Nia's first full night of sleep in weeks. She fumbled for her phone, still half lost in dreams that had featured steel-grey eyes and gentle hands. Nia! Zara's voice was small, frightened. Can you come home? There are people here asking about you. Nia sat up instantly, her heart racing. What people, sweetheart? Where's Mrs. Patterson? She's here, but she's scared too. They have badges, and they're asking about your job, about the man you take care of. Zara's voice dropped to a whisper. They want to know if he's ever given you money or presents. Federal agents at her home, questioning her 8-year-old niece. I'll be right there, Nia said, already pulling on clothes with one hand. Stay with Mrs. Patterson and don't answer any more questions. Okay? 20 minutes later, she pulled into her modest neighborhood in West Asheville, her Honda looking even more battered next to the black SUVs parked outside her small rental house. 2 agents in dark suits waited on her front porch, their presence transforming her sanctuary into a crime scene. Ms. Holloway. The older agent, a woman with sharp features and skeptical eyes, flashed her badge. Agent Lisa Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd like to ask you some questions about your employment with Julian Whittaker. Is my niece all right? She's fine. Your neighbor has been very cooperative. Agent Chen's smile was professional and cold. We understand you've been working for Mr. Whittaker for several days now. That's quite unusual given his track record with caregivers. Nia's mind raced. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had tipped them off, probably hoping to find evidence that she was somehow complicit in Julian's alleged crimes. I do my job, she said carefully. I provide medical care and companionship, nothing more. And yet our sources suggest you've been present during confidential legal meetings, that Mr. Whittaker has shared sensitive information about his case with you. Agent Chen consulted her notes. That level of trust is interesting, don't you think? Sources. Nia felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was watching, reporting back on Julian's activities. Someone close enough to know about the lawyers. Visit, about her presence in those meetings. Mr. Whittaker is isolated and traumatized, Nia replied. And if he occasionally needs emotional support during stressful situations, that's part of my job as a caregiver. Has he offered you any financial incentives to maintain confidentiality? Any gifts, bonuses, promises of future compensation? No. What about romantic involvement? The question came from the second agent, a younger man with calculating eyes. Patients sometimes develop feelings for their caregivers, feelings that might influence their judgment about what information to share. Heat flashed across Nia's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "My relationship with Mr. Whitaker is strictly professional." Even as she said it, she thought about last night, Julian's hand covering hers, the way he'd said her name like a prayer, the electricity that had sparked between them in the quiet darkness of his study. "We'll need to search your home," Agent Chen said, producing a warrant, "standard procedure in cases involving potential witness tampering or obstruction of justice." "I haven't obstructed anything." "Then you won't mind if we look around." Nia watched helplessly as the agents moved through her small house, rifling through her belongings with clinical efficiency. They examined her computer, her bank statements, even the modest jewelry box that held Maya's wedding ring and a few family photos. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor, sat in the kitchen with Zara, both of them wide-eyed and frightened. Nia wanted to comfort them, but every word felt dangerous now, potentially incriminating. "Auntie Nia," Zara whispered when the agents moved to the bedroom, "are you in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, just a misunderstanding." But even as she said it, Nia felt the weight of how complicated her life had become. 3 days ago, she'd been a simple caregiver, taking on a difficult patient. Now she was apparently under federal investigation, her home being searched, her niece traumatized by the implications of associations she barely understood herself. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carmen, "Reporters at the house. Julian asking for you. Are you safe? Reporters." The story was going public, which meant someone wanted maximum pressure on Julian right when he was starting to fight back. Ms. Holloway. Agent Chen emerged from the bedroom, holding a small wrapped package. "What's this?" Nia's heart sank. She recognized the elegant wrapping, the expensive ribbon. A book. "Mr. Whitaker mentioned I enjoyed poetry, so he asked Carmen to order something for me. You didn't think to mention this gift earlier. It's a $20 book of Maya Angelou poems. Hardly a bribe." Agent Chen unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautiful leather-bound collection. When she opened the cover, Nia saw Julian's handwriting on the dedication page. "For Nia, who reminds me that caged birds can still sing, thank you for helping me find my voice again. J." The intimacy of the inscription hung in the air, like an accusation. "Strictly professional," Agent Chen repeated dryly. "I see. It's a thoughtful gesture from a grateful patient. It's evidence of a personal relationship that compromises your objectivity and potentially makes you an accessory to witness tampering." Agent Chen closed the book with a sharp snap. "We'll be keeping this. You can't." "We can, and we are." Agent Chen's expression softened slightly, almost sympathetically. "Miss Holloway, let me give you some advice. Julian Whitaker is going down for federal crimes. The only question is how many people he takes with him. Don't let yourself and your niece become collateral damage in his war with the government." After the agents left, taking the book and copies of her financial records, Nia sat in her violated living room and tried to process what had just happened. Someone, probably Victoria, was systematically destroying anyone who might support Julian's defense. Her phone rang, Julian's number. "Nia, thank God. Carmen told me about the search." "Are you all right?" "They took the book," she said numbly. "The poetry collection. Nia, I'm so sorry. I never meant for you to be dragged into this." "I know." She looked at Zara, who was curled up on the couch with one of Maya's old quilts, her young face creased with worry. "Julian, I need to think about this, about whether I can continue working for you." The silence on the other end of the line stretched painfully. "I understand," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "You have to protect Zara. I would never ask you to sacrifice her safety for me." "It's not just that," Nia's voice cracked. "They know about us, about how we feel. Someone's been watching, reporting back. If they can twist a simple book inscription into evidence of impropriety, what happens when they find out about last night? About the way you looked at me, the way you what? The way I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the admission torn from her like a confession under torture. Julian's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. "Nia, don't," she said quickly. "Don't say anything that will make this harder than it already is. I need time to figure out what comes next. For both of us. How much time?" She looked at Zara again, thought about Maya's sacrifice, about the promise she'd made to always put her niece first. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But Julian, whatever happens, know that these last few days, they mattered. You matter." As she hung up the phone, Naya felt something breaking inside her chest. Not her heart, exactly, but her certainty about what was right and wrong, safe and dangerous, worth fighting for, and worth walking away from. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again over Asheville, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst of the weather was still to come. For 3 days, Nia stayed away from Julian's house, throwing herself into caring for other patients and trying to pretend her heart wasn't breaking. She took extra shifts at the rehabilitation center, volunteered at Zara's school, and deep-cleaned every inch of her small home. Anything to avoid thinking about steel-grey eyes and the way Julian had said her name in the darkness. But Julian Whittaker wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly from anyone's life. On Thursday morning, Carmen appeared at Nia's door with coffee, pastries, and a determined expression that brooked no argument. "We need to talk," she said, settling herself at Nia's kitchen table as if she belonged there. "About Julian, about the case, and about whatever misguided notion of self-sacrifice you've got rattling around in that stubborn head of yours." "Carmen, I can't." "Yes, you can. And you will, because that man is falling apart without you, and frankly, so is everyone else who cares about him." Carmen pulled out her phone, swiping to a news article. "Look at this." The headline made Nia's stomach drop. "Disgraced tech mogul. Julian Whittaker refuses plea deal as federal investigation intensifies. He's fighting back," Carmen continued. "Really fighting, for the first time since the accident. His lawyers have uncovered irregularities in the banking records, discrepancies in the timeline that prove he couldn't have authorized those transactions. They're building a real defense." "That's good," Nia said carefully. "I'm glad he's also not eating, not sleeping, and yesterday I found him trying to transfer himself from his wheelchair to his bed and falling onto the floor." Carmen's voice was sharp with worry. "He fired the new caregiver after 6 hours, said she wasn't, I quote, the right fit for his recovery needs." Nia's chest tightened. "He needs professional help, Carmen, someone who can maintain appropriate boundaries. He needs you. And before you start with the ethical objections, let me tell you what we found out about your FBI visit." Carmen pulled out a manila folder, spreading its contents across the kitchen table. Bank statements, phone records, surveillance photos, the kind of evidence that suggested someone had been planning this attack for months. "Victoria Sterling has been systematically gathering intelligence on Julian's associates for over a year," Carmen said. "I do your background check, your employment history, even your sister's medical records. She had it all before you ever set foot in that house. Why? Because she needed someone close to Julian who could be compromised if necessary. Someone with a vulnerable family member, someone with financial pressures, someone whose caring nature would make them emotionally invested." Carmen's smile was grim. "She chose you specifically because you were perfect for the job, both as Julian's caregiver and as a potential weapon against him." The implications hit Nia like a physical blow. "She planned for me to fall for him. She planned for Julian to trust you, to depend on you, and then for that relationship to be used to destroy his credibility." Carmen leaned forward. "The FBI raid wasn't random, Nia. It was theater. They wanted Julian to see that anyone who gets close to him will be targeted, investigated, potentially prosecuted. And it worked." Nia's voice was barely a whisper. "I walked away." "Yes, you did. Which is exactly what Victoria wanted." Carmen gathered the papers, her movements sharp with anger. "But here's what she didn't count on. Julian isn't the broken man she left behind anymore. He's stronger now, clearer, more determined to fight. And you know why?" Nia shook her head, not trusting her voice, "because for the first time in 18 months, someone looked at him and saw not a victim or a disability or a scandal, but a man worth saving. You gave him back his sense of self-worth. Nia, don't let Victoria take that away from both of you." Before Nia could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Turn on Channel 8 News. Now." Carmen fumbled for the remote, switching on the small television in Nia's living room. The noon news was just beginning, and Victoria Sterling's perfect face filled the screen. Exclusive interview with Victoria Sterling, former fiancée of embattled businessman Julian Whittaker. "Ms. Sterling, you've remained largely silent about your relationship with Mr. Whittaker and the federal investigation. What made you decide to speak out now?" Victoria's smile was carefully practiced, sympathetic but sad. "I've kept quiet out of respect for Julian's privacy and his ongoing health struggles, but recent developments have forced my hand." "What kind of developments?" "Julian has been manipulated by people who don't have his best interests at heart. Specifically, his current caregiver has developed an inappropriate personal relationship with him while he's in a vulnerable state." Victoria's voice carried just the right note of concerned compassion. "I have evidence that this woman has been feeding him information about the investigation, encouraging him to reject reasonable plea agreements, and potentially profiting from her access to his finances." Nia felt the blood drain from her face. On screen, Victoria was describing their relationship in terms that made it sound predatory, manipulative, a sick caregiver taking advantage of a disabled patient. "Are you suggesting that Ms. Holloway is somehow involved in the alleged financial crimes?" "I'm suggesting that Julian is being exploited by someone who sees his wealth and vulnerability as an opportunity." Victoria's eyes filled with practiced tears. "The man I loved would never have committed these crimes. But the man he's become, influenced by people with their own agendas, I'm not sure I recognize him anymore." Carmen muted the television, the silence in the room deafening. "She's brilliant," Nia said numbly. "She's turned everything around. Now I'm the predator and Julian's the victim who needs to be saved from me." "Now you understand what we're really fighting," Carmen replied. "This isn't just about financial crimes or federal investigations. This is about a woman who will destroy anyone and anything to get what she wants." "What does she want?" "Julian's complete destruction. His money, his reputation, his freedom, his ability to ever trust another human being." Carmen stood, gathering her things. "The question is, are you going to let her win?" Nia thought about Julian sitting alone in that big house, probably staring out at the mountains that had once called to him. She thought about the poetry book with his careful inscription, now sitting in some evidence locker. She thought about the way he'd looked at her that last night, like she was something precious and impossible. "If I go back," she said slowly, "Victoria will escalate. She'll find ways to hurt Zara, to destroy my career, to make me radioactive to anyone who might hire me, probably. And if I don't go back—" Carmen paused at the door, her expression sad but understanding. "Then Julian loses the one person who believed he was worth fighting for, and Victoria wins the war she's been planning for 2 years." After Carmen left, Nia sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the place where Victoria's face had been on the screen. Outside, she could hear Zara playing with the neighbors' children, her laughter bright and innocent in the afternoon sun. Some wars, Nia realized, chose you whether you wanted to fight them or not. The only question was whether you faced them standing up or on your knees. By evening, she'd made her decision. Nia arrived at Julian's house at dawn, her Honda Civic looking defiant next to the news vans still camped outside the gates. She'd spent the night explaining to Zara why sometimes adults had to make hard choices, why standing up for what's right sometimes meant accepting risk, and why love, real love, required courage. "But what if the bad people hurt you?" Zara had asked, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of Nia's fears. "And then at least I'll know I tried to protect someone who couldn't protect himself," Nia had replied, thinking of Maya's fierce determination to live fully despite knowing her time was limited. Carmen met her at the door, relief flooding her features. "Thank God, he's in the study. He's been there all night, working on something he won't let me see. Nia found Julian exactly where she'd left him 3 days ago, surrounded by documents, laptop open, but this time there was something different about his posture. He sat straighter, his jaw set with determination rather than defeat. When he looked up and saw her, the transformation in his face was worth every risk she was taking. "You came back," he said quietly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "And I saw Victoria's interview." Nia set her bag down and moved closer, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. "Apparently, I'm a predatory caregiver manipulating a vulnerable, disabled man for his money. And yet here you are. Here I am." She settled into the chair across from him, the same one she'd occupied that first morning when everything had been simpler. "Carmen says you've been working on something." Julian's smile was sharp-edged, dangerous. "I've been working on ending this war Victoria started." He turned his laptop toward her, revealing a complex diagram of financial transactions, dates, and connections. "Look at this." The screen showed a web of money transfers, shell companies, and offshore accounts, but not the ones the FBI was investigating Julian for. These were different, more recent, and all connected to one central point: Mitchell and Associates, Harrison Mitchell's company. While Victoria was gathering evidence against me, she was also funneling information about my competitors' business strategies to Harrison, Julian explained, his voice gaining strength. "Insider trading goes both ways, Nia. She wasn't just destroying me, she was building him up with stolen intelligence." "Can you prove it?" "I can prove the money trail. Carmen's been working with a forensic accountant for 2 weeks. Every business deal Harrison's company closed in the last year was preceded by Victoria having access to confidential information about his competitors' strategies." Julian's fingers drummed against his wheelchair. "And the question is whether anyone will listen to a disgraced tech mogul making accusations against America's golden couple." Nia studied the screen, understanding dawning. "That's why she did the interview yesterday. She's getting ahead of your counterattack." "Exactly. By painting you as my manipulator and me as an unreliable victim, she's undermining any accusations I might make." Julian's expression darkened. "She's very good at this game. Then we need to be better." Nia pulled out her phone, scrolling through the contacts she'd built in 3 years of caregiving: journalists, social workers, disability advocates, people who understood the real dynamics of care relationships. Victoria made one mistake in that interview. "What's that?" "She portrayed you as a helpless victim who can't make his own decisions. That's going to piss off every disability rights activist in the country." Nia's fingers were already typing messages. "She just gave us an army of allies who hate nothing more than the assumption that physical disability equals mental incompetence." Julian stared at her with something approaching awe. "You're not just fighting for me, you're fighting the fight. I'm fighting for the truth. There's a difference." Nia looked up from her phone. "Julian, if we do this, if we really go to war with Victoria and Harrison, there's no going back. They'll use everything against us. Our relationship, my presence here, the fact that I'm falling in love with you, despite every logical reason why I shouldn't." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither of them had expected to cross so soon. "Nia, I know you care about me too. I can see it in how you look at me, how you've changed since I've been here. But we need to be honest about what this is and what it isn't before we move forward." Julian was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. "What do you think this is?" "I think this is 2 broken people who found each other at exactly the wrong time and exactly the right moment." Nia's voice was steady, despite the hammering of her heart. "I think you're the first man who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth protecting, and I'm the first woman who's looked at you and seen someone worth saving. I think we're both terrified of how much we need each other. And what do you think it isn't?" "I think it isn't simple, or safe, or anything either of us planned for." She moved closer, reaching for his hands. "But I also think it's real, Julian. Whatever happens with the investigation, with Victoria, with everything else, what's between us is real. Julian's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and certain. I love you, he said simply. I don't know when it happened or how to make it make sense, but I love you, Nia Holloway. And if you're willing to fight this battle with me, I promise you won't face it alone. Before she could respond, Carmen burst through the study doors, her face flushed with excitement. Julian, you need to see this. Victoria just made a crucial mistake. She handed him her tablet, where a local news website was displaying a breaking story. Exclusive, leaked photos show Victoria Sterling and Harrison Mitchell in secret meetings months before public relationship announcement. The photos were damning. Victoria and Harrison, in what appeared to be intimate conversation at various locations, all dated during the period when she was still engaged to Julian. How did you... Julian began. And I didn't, Carmen said, her smile mysterious. But it seems Victoria isn't the only one who knows how to play chess. Someone just made a very strategic move on your behalf. As they stared at the photos that could change everything, Nia felt a familiar sensation. The same feeling she'd had when Maya was fighting for her life, when Zara had first come to live with her, when every important moment in her life had required her to choose between safety and love. Hey, Julian, she said quietly, I think our army just got bigger. Outside, the news vans were multiplying, but for the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't just covering a scandal, they were covering a war. And Julian Whittaker was no longer fighting it alone. The mountains beyond the windows stood sentinel and eternal, as if reminding them that some peaks were worth the climb, regardless of how treacherous the path might be. The leaked photos changed everything overnight. By morning, Julian's house was no longer just surrounded by scandal-hungry reporters. Now there were disability rights protesters carrying signs that read, "Competence isn't walking," and Victoria Sterling, ableist manipulator. Social media exploded with support for Julian, and disability doesn't mean dumb was trending nationwide. But Victoria Sterling didn't become a master manipulator by backing down when cornered. The counterattack came at noon, swift and brutal. Nia was in the kitchen making lunch when Carmen burst in, her face pale with shock. "Turn on the news, Channel 12, now!" Nia fumbled for the remote, and Harrison Mitchell's handsome face filled the screen. He stood at a podium outside Mitchell and Associates, looking every inch the concerned businessman protecting his company's reputation. "Deeply disturbed by these malicious allegations," he was saying, his voice carrying the perfect note of righteous indignation. "Mr. Whittaker's desperate attempts to deflect from his own criminal behavior by attacking my relationship with Victoria are not only false, but they demonstrate exactly the kind of unethical conduct that led to his current legal troubles." The camera cut to a reporter. "Mr. Mitchell, what's your response to the suggestion that you and Ms. Sterling engaged in insider trading, using information she obtained while engaged to Mr. Whittaker?" Harrison's smile was confident, practiced. "I have complete faith in the justice system's ability to see through these fabrications. Mr. Whittaker is a man whose judgment has been severely compromised, not just by his tragic accident, but by his inappropriate dependence on a caregiver who has clearly exceeded the bounds of professional conduct." "Are you referring to Nia Holloway?" "I'm referring to a pattern of manipulation and poor decision-making that has characterized Mr. Whittaker's behavior since his accident. Victoria ended their engagement because she could no longer watch someone she cared about being led astray by people who don't have his best interests at heart." Nia felt sick. Harrison was good, better than Victoria in some ways. Where she had seemed calculating, he appeared genuinely concerned. Where she had attacked Julian's credibility, he was attacking his mental capacity while maintaining plausible deniability. "Mr. Mitchell, sources suggest that you and Ms. Sterling have been in a relationship for significantly longer than publicly acknowledged. How do you respond to that?" "Victoria and I have been friends for years through industry connections. When her engagement ended and she needed support during a difficult time, I was honored to be there for her. Our romantic relationship developed naturally after she was free to pursue it." Harrison paused, his expression growing somber. "I want to be clear. Victoria Sterling is one of the most ethical, brilliant business minds I've ever encountered. The suggestion that she would compromise her integrity for financial gain is not only insulting, it's laughable to anyone who actually knows her." The interview continued, but Nia had heard enough. She muted the television and sank into a chair, feeling the weight of what they were up against. "He's good," she said numbly. "He's terrifying," Carmen replied. But he just made a mistake." "What mistake?" He confirmed the timeline. Julian's voice came from the doorway, where he sat in his wheelchair with a grim smile. He just admitted on national television that he and Victoria were friends for years through industry connections. Our forensic accountant can now subpoena all their professional correspondence going back 3 years. Nia looked up, hope flickering. "And that's enough for a pattern of collusion. It's enough to demand an investigation into their business relationship independent of our engagement." Julian moved closer, his expression intent. "Harrison just opened a door he can't close. If we can prove they were sharing confidential information before Victoria and I broke up, it establishes conspiracy and fraud." "But only if someone listens," Carmen pointed out. "The FBI is still focused on you, Julian. They're not going to pivot their entire investigation based on leaked photos and suspicious timing. Then we make them listen." Nia stood, moving to the window where the protesters were still gathered. Among them, she could see familiar faces, advocates she'd worked with, families from the rehabilitation center, even some of her former patients. "Carmen, who do we know at the Department of Justice?" "Someone above the FBI field office level?" "My cousin works for the Inspector General's office," Carmen said slowly. "She investigates misconduct within federal agencies." "Why?" "Because if the FBI received false information that led them to target an innocent man while ignoring the real criminals, that's misconduct worth investigating." Nia turned back to Julian, her mind racing. "Why, we don't just defend against Victoria's accusations. We go after the system that enabled her to use federal resources as weapons in her personal vendetta." Julian stared at her with undisguised admiration. "You want to investigate the investigators. I want to expose a conspiracy that goes deeper than insider trading. Victoria didn't just steal from you, Julian. She corrupted a federal investigation to destroy you while protecting her real crimes." Nia pulled out her phone. Carmen, call your cousin." "Now, Nia, if we're wrong about this, if we're wrong, we're exactly where we are now, fighting for Julian's life and freedom. If we're right, we expose a conspiracy that could send Victoria and Harrison to federal prison while completely exonerating Julian." Nia met his eyes steadily. "What do you want to do?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had once represented escape and now seemed to symbolize the peak they were trying to climb together. "I want to finish what she started," he said finally. "But this time, I want to win." Carmen was already dialing her phone when it rang with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen, her eyebrows shooting up. "It's Agent Chen." "The FBI agent who searched your house." "Answer it," Julian said. "Put it on speaker." Agent Chen's voice filled the room, tense and urgent. "Ms. Key Rodriguez, I need to speak with Mr. Whitaker immediately. We've uncovered new evidence that significantly changes the scope of our investigation." "What kind of evidence?" Julian asked. "The kind that suggests Mr. Whitaker may not be our primary target after all. How quickly can you get to the federal building? And Mr. Whitaker, you might want to bring your lawyer, the good kind, not the kind that suggests plea deals." As Carmen hung up the phone, the three of them looked at each other with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "It could be a trap," Carmen said, "or it could be exactly what we've been waiting for," Nia replied. Julian reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that felt both new and eternal. "Either way," he said, "we face it together." Outside, the mountains stood witness to another turning point in their battle, While the protesters' chants grew louder and more determined, Victoria Sterling had started a war, but she was about to discover that some fights create unexpected alliances, and that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who bring you down. The final battle was about to begin, and this time, Julian Whittaker wasn't climbing alone. 6 months later, Naya stood in Julian's kitchen, preparing hibiscus tea and watching the morning mist lift from the Blue Ridge Mountains. The house felt different now, warmer, lived in, filled with the sound of laughter from the garden where Zara was teaching Julian's new golden retriever, Maya, how to fetch sticks. The federal building meeting had changed everything. Agent Chen had discovered that Victoria had been feeding the FBI selective information for over a year, carefully curating evidence to build a case against Julian while concealing her own crimes. When forensic accountants finally examined Harrison's business dealings, they found a pattern of insider trading worth over $50 million, all based on information Victoria had obtained during her engagement to Julian. The trials had been swift and decisive. Victoria Sterling received 8 years for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Harrison Mitchell got 12 years for insider trading and racketeering. The FBI agents who had failed to investigate Victoria's credibility received censure and retraining. Julian's name was completely cleared, his reputation not just restored, but enhanced by his courage in exposing the conspiracy. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the quiet moments like this one, when Naya could watch the man she loved teaching her niece how to be brave. "Auntie Nia," Zara called from the garden. "Julian says Maya Angelou had a dog named Maya too. Is that why you named the puppy that—" "Something like that," Nia called back, smiling at Julian's careful patience as he showed Zara how to throw the ball so Maya could catch it, despite her enthusiastic but clumsy puppyhood. The doctors had said Julian might regain some sensation in his legs with continued therapy and the new treatments his restored wealth could afford. But watching him now, Naya realized it didn't matter. He'd already climbed the mountain that mattered most, the one that led back to believing in himself and in the possibility of love. "You're staring," Julian said, wheeling onto the patio with Zara riding on the back of his chair and Maya bounding beside them. "I'm admiring," Nia corrected, setting down 3 cups of tea and 1 bowl of water. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Zara asked, accepting her cup with the serious attention she gave all matters concerning her aunt's happiness. "When you stare, you're looking at what someone used to be or what you wish they could become," Nia explained, settling into the chair beside Julian. "When you admire, you're seeing exactly who they are right now and loving all of it." Julian reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the same electric familiarity that had shocked them both that first night in his study. 6 months of fighting together, healing together, building something neither of them had known they wanted, and the touch still sent warmth shooting up her arm. "So what do you see when you look at me?" he asked, his grey eyes holding that mixture of vulnerability and strength that had first captured her heart. "I see a man who learned that falling doesn't make you broken," Naya said softly. "And I see someone who discovered that the most important mountains aren't the ones you climb alone, but the ones you climb with people who refuse to let you fall. And when I look at you," Julian said, his thumb tracing across her knuckles, "I see the woman who taught me that caring for someone isn't about fixing them, it's about believing they're worth saving exactly as they are." "Ooh," Zara said with 8-year-old disgust, but her smile was radiant. "But are you going to get married and make me wear a frilly dress?" "Would you mind," Julian asked seriously, "if I asked your aunt to marry me? I mean—" Zara considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Will you keep making her smile like that? Every day for the rest of my life, if she'll let me? And will you teach me how to make tea that doesn't taste like grass?" "That's a deal." Zara grinned and turned to Nia. "I think you should say yes when he asks." "Which he's going to do soon because he keeps looking at that drawer where he thinks he hid the ring box." Julian's mouth fell open. "How did you—" "I'm 8, not blind, Zara said matter-of-factly. Also, Carmen told me yesterday when she was teaching me Spanish curse words. Nia burst into laughter, the sound bright and free in the mountain air. Julian Whittaker, are you planning to propose to me? I was planning to be more romantic about it, he said, pulling the small velvet box from his pocket with a sheepish grin. Maybe at sunset, with candles, possibly some poetry involved. I don't need romance, Nia said, her voice thick with emotion. I just need you. When Julian opened the box, the ring inside took her breath away, not because it was expensive, though it clearly was, but because it was perfect. A simple band with a stone the exact color of hibiscus tea, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the light like tears of joy. Nia Holloway, Julian said, his voice steady and sure. You walked into my life when I was convinced I had nothing left worth fighting for. You saw a man worth saving when all I could see was a collection of broken pieces. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you that love isn't about being perfect? It's about being present. Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. As Julian slipped the ring onto her finger, Zara cheered and Maya barked, and the mountain stood witness to another beginning in a story that had started with tea and poetry and the radical act of refusing to give up on someone who had given up on himself. Later that evening, as Zara played with Maya in the living room and dinner simmered on the stove, Nia and Julian sat on their patio watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Do you ever miss it? Nia asked quietly. The climbing, the physical challenges, the person you were before. Julian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the peaks that had once called to him with their promise of conquest and solitude. I miss the simplicity of it sometimes, he said finally. The way you could measure success by reaching the summit, failure by falling short. But I've learned something about mountains that I never understood when I could climb them. What's that? The best views aren't always from the top. Sometimes they're from exactly where you are, with exactly the right person beside you. He turned to look at her, his grey eyes soft with contentment. But I wouldn't trade this view for all the summits in the world. As the stars began to appear above Asheville and the evening settled around them like a blessing, Nia realized that Maya had been right all those years ago. The caged bird did sing, not because it was imprisoned, but because it had learned that freedom wasn't about escaping the cage. Sometimes freedom was about choosing to stay, to build something beautiful within the walls that used to confine you, to discover that home wasn't a place you climbed to, it was a person you climbed with. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that person taught you that the most beautiful mountains weren't made of stone and earth, but of love and trust and the courage to keep reaching for each other, one day at a time. The end. Would you risk everything for someone you've only known for a few days? Nia faced an impossible choice. Protect her niece Zara and keep her life safe, or fight alongside Julian against powerful enemies who could destroy everything she'd built. She chose love and courage, even knowing she could lose it all. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Would you have Nia's courage to face a war that wasn't yours, simply because you believed someone deserved to be saved? Tell us, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken for love or justice? Was it worth it? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.